last time around we had a decision to have a list of both tentatively accepted EIPs and properly accepted EIPs and try to get client implementations for all of them. And then depending on how far along we would get with those, to potentially split Istanbul into two upgrades. So one that would be scheduled this fall and another one early next year. So I guess we can start with updates from any clients around just how they're doing related to implementation.
So I'll speak for Pantheon. We have the EAPs implemented. We don't have ProgPow, we don't have the EC Curve one implemented, but we have, as well as the spec EIPs out there in our current development branch.
For Nethermind, we have the EIP 1344, we have 2028, and the remaining two we are starting soon. We don't have ProgPow. It's about adding the bindings for the library. Spoke to Pavel before about it. One thing, AC arithmetic, we are waiting here for some decisions whether this will be coming in. Everything else seems to be rather small.
And do we have any other client teams on the call? It doesn't look like we have anyone from Geth or Parity, right?
Well, I can partially help with those. There will be two reference pull requests for implementations for Guess and
We
Parity.
don't have ProgPow.
With Parity having using the Rust implementation and Guess using the bindings to the C library. So if someone else wants to use the C library, it's also an option.
EAP, right? For the elliptic curve.
Yeah. This is for EC EC precompile.
Got it. Thanks for the update. So that's basically point one on the agenda, but or the first sub-bullet for point one. Obviously, it would be great to have an update from Parity and Geth on this as well. So we should probably have this as an action before the next call to get a status update from both of them. Does anyone have anything else to add on this? Okay. So the second part of this agenda item was a last call for any EIPs that want to be considered for like the tentatively accepted section. So in practice, this means very unlikely for the October part of the fork if it's split, but possibly for the January part. So anything that's already been proposed for Istanbul, but that hasn't been accepted yet. So does anyone have opinions or suggestions here?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. There's a few of them in there that I'm interested in. We're interested on the EWASM team. Unfortunately, neither Pavel nor Alex could make the call, but we'd like to see particle gas costs 2045 moved into the tentatively accepted category. I can elaborate on why. I guess in some ways it carries the torch for 615. There was a call a few months ago, and during the 615 discussion, people asked for benchmarks to show what kind of speed improvements could be expected. And so it turns out huge speed improvements are possible even without introducing subroutines and changing how jumps work. And we published benchmarks showing big speed ups that are on the table. And so from the EWASM team's perspective, also this particle gas cost, I would argue it even carries the torch for, it's an alternative to introducing WASM onto the one of the big potential benefits of WASM is the speed up. Well, it turns out that you get a big speed up if you just optimize the EVM in the client, and which will be a lot easier and happen much sooner than integrating WASM. So I think it's fair to say that reducing gas costs is the main priority of the EWASM team. So we're definitely interested in that one.
So one of the things I would like to see with that is a possible schedule of, great, so we have particle gas cost. What would be the proposed gas costs for all of the operations? I think that would give us a better scope for just how impactful it would be.
Yep, that's a good point, and that's something we want to work on. So, yeah, obviously, that a new gas schedule would, we would not won't have enough time to propose that by, for the Istanbul Part 1, but for the follow up, I think there's plenty of time to propose that. And I mean, once you have the new gas cost table, then the implementation is fairly trivial, with the exception of versioning. If it's going to be versioned, then obviously that adds to the complexity, but that's a different discussion.
Before we dive into this more, can we get a list of what are the ones that are trying to get in, and start from that and say that, get
Hi,
that
can you hear me?
So, go ahead, Leonardo.
Yeah, sorry. This is Leo from Solidity. Yeah, I think Pavel also wanted to discuss, I mean, he's not going to be here, but he wanted to start a discussion on 663 regarding some comments about multi-byte opcodes and backwards compatibility.
Yeah, there was that comment, and Alex left a comment also around potentially having, so first comment around having thematic hard forks if you want, and the second comment was about Istanbul, saying it might be nice to focus on gas repricing because we already have 1108, 1884 as tentatively accepted. It might make sense to, and 2028, it might make sense to also consider 2045, which was, I believe, the one just discussed, 2046 and 2200. So to just have this focus around gas cost changes. So there's those. There's 663, which was just mentioned. Does anyone on the call have other ones they'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I would add 1559 to that, the gas market, the fee market change.
I'm interested what ended up with 1109 or similar EIPs which were about reduced cost to precompiles. I mean, for a call to precompile address or static call to precompile address.
So 1109 is on the list as rejected, withdrawn, and this list for the rejected, withdrawn was they didn't have a reference implementation 2 weeks ago, so they were declared out of scope for Istanbul. The same with the one about the fee market change, because there's no prototype. All there is, there's still designs going on with it. That doesn't mean it's dead in general. Work should progress. It can make the next train. But I think we made the decision then that if you didn't have a reference implementation or it wasn't super simple, that it was not sufficiently long to be ready for an October hard fork.
Yes, and I would say that fits with talking about the October hard fork. There is a conversation I think that's worth having when thinking about a January or February other hard fork, specifically if we're talking about having rebalancing and repricing really come together within these two forks, because we just released today a like a full implementation. I'm trying to remember the word, implementation study of what it would take to do 1559, and I can go into that when it's time to talk about that, but that is something I'd like to address on this call.
Back to the question about reducing gas costs to precompiles. There is EIP 2046 in the proposed section. So that's, yeah, I mean, that looks like an option to be moved up to tentatively accepted.
What was that number again?
2046.
Static calls made to precompiles. I mean, it looks simple. The question there is, do the benchmarks support it? So for January, it should be easy if we can get, you know, someone to run benchmarks on it.
So do we want to agree to move 2046 to tentatively accepted? Does anyone disagree with that?
I'd just like to ask if we measured how would the combined result of the AltBN implementation and the reduced static call affect the performance of the VMs, like the precompiles? Because we'll be going down from 1200 to something like 190.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's why we need to get some follow up, because technically it's a simple EIP. It's just a gas cost change.
Sorry to beat this dead horse, but do we have some sort of analysis or simulator that can show us, you know, if you look at the contracts on chain, what these gas changes would do to the existing contracts?
No. And for me, that for those kind of gas costs or ones we're talking about gas costs, that's like what should be the barrier for them to being moved from tentatively accepted to actually getting in. I guess the changes are small, but instead of having a lot of work around ref limits, implementations, and testing, there should be a lot of work about investigating the effects of the gas changes.
Well, we all know, you know, this gas bucketing thing is a knapsack problem. I mean, there's just a lot of the way the gas model works. There just is naturally a lot of work that has to be done to assert that these gas changes are safe. That's just the nature of gas, well, Ethereum gas at least. So, I mean, I'm very aggressively in favor of changing gas pricing to make it better, and I actually understand that it'll be a continuous effort. But because it is going to be a continuous effort, I feel like we should have a more formal approach to making the changes.
I mean, there is a pretty good benchmark system, a couple of them actually. The one for pricing precompiles, and both of them were done by Martin Swendy. But where it gets complicated with this 2046, I mean, the benchmark scripts, they'll benchmark the precompiles themselves, but not really considering calling them from other contracts. But it doesn't seem like the whole point. The EIP explains that it's just reducing the cost back from, you know, when it was raised, when the cost of call was raised, and the cost of call was raised because when you call another contract, you know, there's disk latency, but when you call it precompiled, there is no disk latency, so it doesn't. This 20, you know, in theory, it doesn't make sense to charge the same for calling a precompile as it does to call a contract. But benchmarks of calling, you know, contracts versus calling precompiles yet, I don't think that's been done yet.
Rick, I generally think that just analyzing the existing contracts when bringing gas down, maybe it's not the most important thing in a way that we could this way explore any security issues like we had with 1283. But performance-wise, I think we should be much more worried about bringing the gas much down and then someone posting the contract that would spin the EVM the same thing, and if it's underpriced, it can cause the trouble as in the past.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm just security focused, generally speaking. So I completely agree with what you're saying in terms of what the engineering exercise should be, but the approval process should include. I mean, we should be able to literally analyze all the existing contracts on chain and say that this isn't going to cause any of them to become a DOS vector. I'm not trying to make extra work for people. It just seems like we've already run into this problem once, and it's in something that's like very well understood to be a hard, like just a hard thing to intuit. So I feel like since we spend so much time, again, I think it's important to fix the gas, you know, to improve gas, and so we're going to spend a lot of time doing it. So why not just, you know, run some tests to make that process, you know, formalize some tests to make that process better. So I understand what you're saying about the engineering effort, and I completely agree with that. But I'm not trying to disagree with that.
Yeah, agreed. I think we have amazing work from Martin Swendy on particular opcodes, analyzing the pricing, current pricing, and the relation to the actual cost. But we don't have the same tooling for analyzing contracts, at least not posted as a research or report showing the results. And the other thing is, I wonder if the precompiles were ever analyzed. We always analyzed with the cost of call as something that is assumed, or the precompiles were analyzed as the independent thing with the whatever the call cost is, and the precompiles are priced properly. That's why I was asking about the EIP 1108 in combination with 2046, if that's still safe.
As far as I know, at least the existing EC pairing precompile, which is 1108 is about, was benchmarked only on based on just the code which is executed, without anything which touches the EVM, at least in a parity benchmarks.
So based on this discussion, do we want to move any of the gas costs EIPs into tentatively accepted, kind of dependent on those types of benchmarks? Unfortunately, Martin's not on the call, and it doesn't seem like the champions for most of the EIPs are either. Or do we want to go over the specific EIPs and discuss those, and then on a case by case basis, perhaps move them in or out?
I'm kind of thinking we should leave them proposed unless we're certain we want to do it and we're just waiting. I don't know. We're getting quite late to be moving the chairs around before we ship on a hard fork if we're going to do it. So we should probably go over them, but I'm a little skeptical.
Well, was there an expectation that this meeting was the last one to move on to tentatively accepted? Is that no longer the case, and it will be an option on later calls?
Yeah, so this meeting was the last one to move to tentatively accepted. And I think even that is probably means more the second part of Istanbul if it's broken down than the first one. And so that's just why I was asking, because if there's some we'd like to have in, we probably should discuss them today and try to get consensus on them rather than waiting a few more weeks to do that.
I would support them getting in with the as the conditions that you had said, where the tentative, most of the ones that are in tentatively accepted have some kind of implementation that is tricky to test, and gas ones have their own specific one, and I feel that is totally fair to put them in that category. Because if they don't get it done in the next little bit, then they're for sure out. But they can at least be in the tentatively accepted and not in the out of bucket.
Generally, I agree. I would just suggest going over them one by one, so we clearly state that they're going to tentatively accepted instead of just taking them as a whole. But I generally think that we are all right to move them to tentatively accepted.
Okay, let's go through the list.
Yeah.
Who wants to lead it?
Yeah, and I guess just to clarify the list, the ones that were proposed were 663 for the swap and dupe, then 2045, which we kind of talked about, 2046, 2200, and which was already in, I believe, but there was a comment about it, and then 1559. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to propose or bring up?
So it's a different list than I see here,
Oh.
because I see 1559 as rejected and 7 proposed EIPs on the list.
Oh, got it. Okay, yes. So you're working from the Meta EIP. I was just looking at the agenda and the comments that people had in there. We can definitely go through the list of proposed because it's pretty small, and the only one that's not in that and was rejected is the 1559, which James mentioned earlier on the call that he'd still like to discuss given their report from today. So yeah, let's go through the proposed lists and just include 1559 as well as part of that discussion. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. So just in order, 663, unlimited swap and dupe.
I'm okay to move it to tentatively accepted.
Does anyone?
What about the concern about multi-byte instructions? Is there anyone to speak to that on either side?
Yes, we were talking about that yesterday. I mean, not inside this little team and also with Pavel. And I don't know how you guys feel about accepting it or like doing it without the account versioning, because as Andre posted, he already wrote a test that would be broken with the multi-byte opcode. And Pavel suggested to scan the current contracts to see if this would affect any, but still, even if you don't affect any at the moment, or if you can get like a confirmation that most contracts wouldn't be affected, how do you feel about this being a general conceptual problem?
So where's that test that he broke it with? I found it.
It's in the Ethereum Magicians thread.
Is that also broken for push 1 through push 20? Are those safe from that as well?
Those are, wait, I think those are safe.
Okay, I'll discuss it on the thread.
Okay. Yeah, I guess this can just go on the thread. I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Yeah. Just to add to this versioning issue, versioning, might also be a good combination with 2045, the particle gas costs. And the only way to, it's obviously a much longer discussion than we can have in one call. So, and the only way to continue the discussion and leave them as options for, for Istanbul Part 2 is by moving them to tentatively accepted. So I'm definitely in favor of moving these to tentatively accepted so that we can continue the discussion.
Great. So does anyone oppose moving it to tentatively accepted? Okay, so let's do that. Next one on the list was 1352, specify the address range for precompile / system contracts.
This is one where we're not sure if there's any EVM impacts on it. And there hasn't been much discussion on the ETH Magicians thread about it.
I don't recall much discussion on the core devs call about it either, at the very least, kind of in the past handful of calls. Does anyone feel strongly that this should be in for Istanbul? And if not, should we just reject it from Istanbul and leave it as a consideration for another upgrade if anyone comes on a future call and advocates for it?
I think we can get the value out of this without having to put it as part of a hard fork, just get a practice that certain ranges are reserved. I think this is an out of hard fork EIP. I know some of the GET people have been advocating that too. So let's move it out unless there's objection.
The same for 1803 as well.
Seconded.
Okay, does anyone disagree with moving 1352 and 1803 out of Istanbul?
Oh, that's fine.
Great, so let's do that. 1352, 1803 moved out, so that leaves EIP 1380 in the middle, so reduced gas costs for call to self.
I think that falls in the same category that Rick has mentioned about needing to have some more analysis on the gas impact. So that could go to tentative on that, conditioned on good analysis.
Yeah, I would agree. Let's move it to tentatively, but let's have the results of benchmarks for all the EIPs that are affecting gas cost.
Sounds good. Does anyone, oh, sorry, does anyone disagree? Okay, and then just to be sort of, I guess, numerically consistent, the next one would be EIP 1559, although it's not exactly in the list. And I know, James, you wanted to give an update on that?
Yeah, it's okay to do that one last.
Okay, sure. So then the next one would be EIP 1985, same limits for certain EVM parameters. Does anyone feel strongly this should be pushed into tentatively accepted? Otherwise, I think the default should probably be it's dropped from Istanbul.
I mean, I second the Martin's Wendy's mentioned risks with this one from the last call, or like 2 calls ago. But I would like to see some work on it because it's long outstanding. So I would like to see it in tentatively accepted and some further discussion on it, but I'm not strongly favoring it.
So that's a vote to not kill it.
Yeah, but a weak vote to not kill it.
Yeah, I know Alex cares about this one, so I'd voice his support in his absence.
You mean Alex, Egg6 Alex?
Yeah, Axic.
Yeah.
Let's move it to tentatively accepted then.
Yeah, and just for the record, what would we like to see out of this one? So what would it take for it to go from tentatively to fully accepted?
Reference tests with the extreme numbers that show breakage. That's probably what I would want to see. I want to see how the clients act when presented with values outside the ranges.
Yes, this will be important. And also what Martin mentioned is the question of whether we look at it only from the EVM perspective or also from outside of EVM perspective, because it affects how we define whether the transaction is constructed properly or not. And the same for probably a few other items within the domain, like probably not block headers, but this is the idea, right? So do we only change the way we look at gas limits in EVM inside, or when we deserialize and accept our RLP or not?
Yeah, I think the reference test can handle will it accept invalid RLPs of block headers and transactions. So I think that's really what we need as unit tests, is reference tests. So I think is what we need out of it.
Great. Anything else on 1985? Okay. Next one on the list is 2045 particle gas costs, which we kind of hinted at earlier.
Yeah, and I think this one we need the table of proposed and the same gas analysis. We're asking for all of the gas ones. Although it might be harder without an implementation.
Absolutely. We do have an implementation for this. But...
Awesome.
So do we want to move this to tentatively accepted as well? Does anyone disagree with that?
I just didn't see much discussion on it because I believe it was added quite late. Or...
It was proposed at the deadline, and there was a lot of stuff that got discussed before it could even get near it. So it's because there wasn't room to discuss it mostly, I'd say. Let's not kill it yet.
Yeah, I'm not opposing it. I think it's an interesting change. I just would like to see more discussion on it and some benchmarks as for the others.
That makes sense. So 2045 as tentatively accepted as well. And final one on this list was 2046, reduced gas costs for static calls made to precompiles.
Standard gas cost caveats, don't kill it yet.
So does anyone disagree with this, moving it to tentatively accepted? Okay, so I guess, yeah, just for the record, it's worth stating again, all these gas cost ones we're moving into tentatively accepted still would require, you know, a lot more benchmarking done to be considered to to be shipped on a hard fork, but hopefully having them and having your final list helps us focus the discussion and give the teams championing those the sort of signal that they need to work on those benchmarks. And then now that we're over with this list, James, do you want to talk about 1559?
Yes. So we had Matt Slipper do a implementation study of 1559 and further go into specifically like where in the Geth code base and what changes would need to be made in order to implement it. And he recommended a 2-fork process as one of the updates. One introducing the transaction fee change, and then also both transaction types exist at the same time, and then a transition function that will make it so over a period of time, the gas to the 1559 will be given more allocation, and the original transaction type will get less allocation. And then after that, there'll be a second fork, which will clean up the old transaction type, and then will unlock any that's left of the 16 million gas limit that hasn't been reached with that function. So the reason why it's important to talk about with this conversation is in the process of going through 1559, we realized that the taking away gas is easy to do, but it's the more difficult part is going to be incentivizing wallets and users to use the new transaction type during the time when there's this transition of them both existing. And the simplest solution to solve that is to provide an incentive to move to this second transaction type. And specifically, gas costs is the easiest way to do that. So with the reduction of gas costs or any changes to gas costs being tied to using the new transaction type means that's where we get our incentivized leverage from. So if we go through a fork that does a very heavy hand on optimizing gas price and gas costs, and we don't have this fee change be implemented at the same time, we lose that incentive mechanism for transition.
So 1702 is currently defined, would have rules apply to the current contract address and the version of the contract. This would propose a different scheme where any gas prices would not be tied to the contract version of the executing code, but to the transaction originating the call, no matter how far down the stack.
Can you repeat that question? I'm not sure I entirely understood it.
So 1702, the versions apply to the current contract message frame, whatever contract message frame we're in. So when I was implementing it in Pantheon, the gas price changes would only affect, if we version the gas price changes, it would only affect the contract version. But I want to make sure if I'm hearing this correctly, that this would propose not that strategy, but a different strategy, which is the gas cost changes don't matter about what current contract we're in. It's about the transaction that initiated all the calls. So if the transaction came in with a new format, all of the contracts would get the reduced fee, the recall, no matter when they were deployed. Whereas if you called with the old format, they would all have the old version. It wouldn't matter when these contracts were deployed.
Yeah, so I mean, this is sort of, I guess, anticipates, my previous comments anticipated these sorts of discussions, right? When we're having all these things that are messing around with the gas costs, they're gonna, it's not clear what the interference is gonna be, right? So I wasn't aware of 1702 when I proposed these sort of changes. And I think it's just a matter of when 1702 gets in. If 1702 gets in before 1559, then it would apply to, the old transaction types and the new transaction types. If it's withheld to be applied with 1559, then it would only apply to the new transaction types. So there has to be a branch. You know, there's a big branch in the code that says, is this a new transaction or an old transaction?
And there's specification for how to do this process in the implementation study as well.
Did that answer the question? Because I'm not entirely sure that.
I think it did, because we haven't decided what's going to be assigned to any versions. It's 1702 is kind of on the bubble because transactions of versions have fallen out of favor since 615 has been withdrawn by the authors. So we could just let this win and have 1702 figured out when it's ready to come back in the scene.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of timing, I hope, you know, part of the reason we took our time and got this proposal written and have been talking to people who are running simulations. I've talked to a number of teams that do simulations. I'm continuing to talk to teams that do simulations, is because this transition, having two transaction types on the network at the same time is pretty intense. But I can't figure out another. I mean, to me, it's just a parsimonious way of allowing, you know, we're changing how transactions work. So every piece of software that interacts with the system is either reading or writing transactions. So we can't just get rid of them, right? So so the reason we're taking our time is to make sure that we actually have sufficient testing in place, and obviously that testing, those testing frameworks, those harnesses, what have you, could be reused in these cases where we have potentially interfering EIPs or EIPs that, you know, we want to test them all together, right? I mean, we're going to have to be taking forks of Geth and then running those forks of Geth and running in simulation. And so I think that should just be a part of the process. You know, once we've done that, obviously, you know, moving forward, all EIPs could use that process.
I have mixed feelings here. So there are a few things. First of all, the specification doesn't define clearly of the split into two stages. The second thing is it was already rejected, so I'm kind of unwilling to have some kind of situation when we reject something and resurrect, and it opens the door for others to start resurrecting heaps.
So how does it get? How would it get into Istanbul Part 2? I mean, is this what we're doing moving forward, having a Part 1, Part 2, and if you get rejected from Part 1, you're rejected from Part 2?
I think that was when we proposed Part 2, that was the idea, that Asagio would still be going on, whether it's in April or July, and things that are rejected are still in Asagio, still eligible for that. I think the original idea for the two-part was just to have the biggest ones and not have it collect everything, which would have been the EC generic contracts and ProgPal come in January, because those require a bit more client implementation time and testing effort. And the smaller ones that were consisting mostly of gas cost changes, we could get reference tests together much easier for proposed hard fork of the testnet beginning in September. So I think that's what was the original idea of it. And I do sympathize. If we're going to keep the trains running on time, we need to set deadlines. When the cabin door closes, the plane's on its way. And if you're not in, you know, talk to your travel agent and get a new ticket.
I respect that was in the context of the October fork. It's a lot different now that we're talking about using all of the gas cost changes at the same time, which that is an important part of getting the adoption of this, having the incentive mechanism work for 1559.
So what if instead of applying a different gas schedule on each version of the transactions, what if there was a multiplier that the old ones cost 1.1 as much and they cost 1.2 as much up until they cost 2 times as much or 5 times as much from the gas to a gigawatt multiplier? Was that approach considered, or was the scheduled approach found superior to that for some reason?
I mean, we didn't really think about adding an artificial multiplier to make gas more expensive. Again, that seems to me to be less parsimonious. I mean, here's how I'm looking at the conversation right now, and apologies because I admit I'm not participating all the time. But if collectively we agree that 1559 is important, which I don't know how people feel about that, then, and we agree that we need to have an incentivization mechanism to have people move to 1559, which I think is something that we should all be able to agree to or disagree to very quickly, then we need to provide the you know, I'm not opposed to the policy at all of saying something's postponed or what have you, but if all of the gas fee changes are used, or if all the gas reductions are used, then we have to come up with this other method that is probably going to be more complicated. So it just seems, no matter what we, you know, by partitioning the changes, that seems to me to be the most parsimonious solution. I'm totally open to doing other things that add, to me, more complexity. And I'm open to suggestions. I'm fine if you know, if the EIP wasn't ready, it wasn't ready. I'm not upset about that either. But I'm not in any particular rush, frankly. But I am concerned about how we're going to incentivize people to transition to the new transaction type. That's my concern.
I think applying two different schedules based on how the transaction is put in the system, I think is more difficult than after the transaction is executed, looking up on a table and applying a multiplier to the gas cost. I think that one is much less of an impact on the code than using multiple schedules. And using multiple schedules, I think, provides unneeded complexity. I mean, it is one way to incentivize it, but I think the cost is higher than we expect.
I think we should make a strong statement that we generally would like to see 1559 as a moving forward for the entire network, but I would like to keep discussing in separation from other EIPs and say it should have its own way of incentivization and not be delivered by other gas cost changes.
So I remember in April it was suggested to like split the block gas limit in half, and one half would be reserved just for 1559 style transactions. Is that still being considered?
That's still the case. That's still the case.
Okay, so I mean, then if the, you know, old fee market and block gas limit, if that's filled up, there's a natural incentive for people to go to the, you know, like the express lane that's, you know, with, it's more open and cheaper. But
Well, yes, but that incentive is at the user level, not at the developer level, right? Someone has to actually write the patches to the changes. And yeah, and they're not incentivized to do that if they, you know, if their transactions get through, if they don't push a patch and their transactions just work, then they're going to wait till the last minute. We might as well just do a hard switch. Yeah.
And that includes UI, UX changes for wallets as well, so that it's not like a wallet can say, hey, just use new transaction. It'll be pretty significant.
Yeah, for that reason, the sooner we say that we seriously consider that change to be introduced, the better for the wallet creators to adjust. At the same time, the amount of discussion that we're having around it now would say that maybe it's too early to say it will be in Istanbul.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally fine with me. I mean, I'm happy. I wanted there to be a discussion around the document. So you know, it's I mean, that's what I said in the ETH Magicians. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy to just have a discussion regarding this document and maybe additional documents, but I don't know if that'll be necessary or not. So at a minimum, I'm happy to have a discussion about this one.
Yeah, and I would echo that with my proposal to talk about it is also in the same spirit.
So considering how fresh the document is and how much open questions there are, I do think there's too much uncertainty to get in a January fork.
Okay, I mean that's fine with me.
But I think it's a good idea, and I think we should continue with it.
So we're gonna have to open a tentatively accepted section for the next hard fork. No, just kidding. Yeah, yeah. Cool. So just for like clarity, do we want to say 1559 stays withdrawn or rejected from Istanbul? But you know we obviously want to see this change and just point people towards the document.
Yeah, and maybe we should change rejected withdrawn to say missed the boat or something a little softer.
Sure. I think for now, just to not get into EIP1 discussions, let's just say it's out of Istanbul.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the asterisk is when we're talking about gas changes, we should also think about 1559 in context.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So I think we made it through the first. Oh, actually, I was gonna say I think we made it through the first agenda item, but I just saw there was a comment about 2200 in the GitHub agenda. I don't know if anyone can speak to that, but basically a proposal to flat out reject 2200. Yeah, so I'm not sure if anyone has strong opinions there. If not, it might make sense to pause the discussion until someone who does is on the call.
So looking at the GitHub, his three arguments were that it hasn't been submitted finally as a draft, which can be fixed relatively easily. It's based on 1706, which is still a draft. It's actually replacing 1706. So really 1706 to be withdrawn. But the most substantive argument is about two things relating to alternative fixes for 1283. My take on it is we were so far down the process that we know there's so many ways we could fix this. We got to pick one. And unless the one that 2200 proposes is objectively wrong, we're letting perfect be the enemy of the better. Maybe it is objectively wrong. That's probably the discussion we need to have, though.
And just because no one is jumping in to sort of counter argue that, I think it might make sense to just to not remove it from the tentatively accepted list and potentially have this conversation on the next call, just because the person who posted the comment can't make it, and neither is Wei, who's been championing this EIP.
Yeah, Wei would be the best one to defend it because he's got the most details on it. I seem to recall that the second argument about, or one of the arguments about why don't we just give a bigger refund later was withdrawn last week. One of these arguments I think was withdrawn if Wei has better memory about it. But me personally, I'm not seeing anything that says that the proposed solution is not objectively false. We're picking colors of a bike shed at this point. But if it's objectively wrong, we should fix it. So that's what we need to look for, is those sorts of requests.
Okay.
So would there still be a chance to move 2200 from tentatively accepted to accepted for Istanbul in October and on the testnet?
So I
thought it was accepted last week.
It's tentatively accepted. I feel like for what the consensus was for all of the tentatively accepted ones was if we can get the implementation done soon enough that we can hard fork the testnets still on September 4th, then it makes sense to have that be part of the October fork. And realistically, I guess that means, if the clients have not implemented it by the next call, then it's probably not making it for October, because the next call is mid-August. Then we'll have one that'll be late August, which is like a week before the fork. So I feel like next call is probably the one where if the clients have not all implemented implemented it and there's still implementation details to figure out, then it would get pushed back to January. This is just my opinion, though, so I'm curious what everyone else thinks about this.
I would be in favor of changing this requirement from all clients are implementing it to just there are tests, like tests available on Ethereum tests that can cover particular EIP. If there are tests, then we don't have to have all of the clients implementing it straight away, I think. I mean, if you say, like in 2 weeks even, we can have the tests and the clients follow up. So get and party will be important. And if they are there and if we have tests, it's enough.
Yeah, the reason I was focusing on client implementation is because the call 2 weeks from now will basically be 2.5 weeks before the testnet hard fork. And from last call, it seemed like pretty much the minimum time you would want between like releasing a new version and actually forking the network.
And the next fork after, so there's part 1 of Istanbul, part 2 of Istanbul is in January, and then Asiago is in April.
So there wasn't like a final consensus on either of those. I think Way last time had an objection with January, saying maybe February would be better. So say the part 2 would be sometime Q1, and then there was discussion about whether or not the next update should be in April or a bit farther, so like around July.
Okay.
One way to look at it is maybe we're pulling Asiago up 2 months and pulling Brie up 3 months. The way we're going at it right now.
So January, February, and then April, May for whatever's after Istanbul.
Probably July.
July.
February, July feels a bit better than doing 2-3 month forks, but maybe we'll be good at it by then. I don't know. I think it's too early to call Asiago. I think we need to see how Istanbul the first lands.
So does that mean part 2 is the name is Asiago?
No, part 2 is the thick fork.
Just in the interest of time, because we could spend a full hour figuring out the name. I know conformance testing was the second point on the agenda, and a lot of people wanted to discuss this, and it kind of ties into what you were mentioning, Thomas.
Yeah, my mention was more about, we say that it's enough to have reference implementation. Why I wouldn't like to have situation when you have one reference implementation and this considered to be enough for inclusion in the hard fork, because the testing is much more important for other clients usually than just the reference implementation. Because testing has to be in the end based on a reference implementation. So it's a bit more of a strong requirement.
So I don't see Dimitri on the call to speak to this, but one of the things that he's been writing is a tool called retesteth. And what it does is it takes the reference tests, and instead of expecting your client to read the JSON, it expects your client to expose JSON RPC ports. So in theory, you could stand up right now, Aleph and Geth both support it. You could write your reference tests against Aleph or Geth and have the fillers figured out from there. Pantheon should be coming in about a week or two. So from that, you can write your reference tests for wherever your reference implementation is. And I think it's on, hopefully it's going to show up on Parity shortly. That would be great if it could. And Trinity would be a great add too. But this is a tool that, we don't have to be Aleph hackers to figure out how to make the filler work. We can follow the instructions that Dimitri has left online to write the reference test. So I think that is something that, as developers and authors of these EIPs, that we should, for the next community hard fork, I personally want to apply the hard rule that not only do you have to have a reference implementation, you need to have test cases, ideally test cases in the form of reference tests. And for the gas changes, these are like the ideal tests because there's no easy things to test. It's trivial to test. It's like, great, let's test it in a reference method. So it's something that we can throw against other clients to make sure that they have the same logic as they're writing it. So we definitely should, I don't know who's up for it, just write some of these reference tests for these changes that we think should be going in. If it's your EAP, find the docs that Dimitri wrote and spin it up against Geth or Aleph if that's where your reference implementation is.
Yes, what we see is that all the EAPS proposers are very happy to implement as much as they can, but very often they are being stuck because they have to wait for some of the client developers to deliver the implementation for them. If we deliver a good set of tools and retest S is something amazing, something that we really need, and then there is a bigger chance that the EAPS will be proposed in a more holistic way, the one that will allow us to introduce something we found really worrying, whether it can be implemented or not.
Yeah, because Dimitri earlier today on the Gitter said, so if an EAP is accepted, I see the proposal as test section. The question is how obligated to provide the test for the EAP. There will be many EAPs and only one testing team. Here's an example of the kind of test might be needed for the new opcode, and he linked to something in the Aleph repo. So, this is something that, we can't just throw over the fence and hope the QA team handles. I think we need to be, we need to pitch in and do these things at all levels.
And the direct answer is there isn't anybody, if I'm just being frank about it.
Mm-hmm.
Or not to mince words.
So given that like Dimitri is not on the call,
No.
oh, sorry.
I'm here.
Oh,
He is.
Oh, he is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I had the wrong Dimitri. Oh, sorry. Did I sell retest that sufficiently for you?
Yes, thanks very much. You described it very well. Well, it actually supports GET right now and the state tests. So you could run and you could generate the state tests using the GET version. Aleph is not stable and the blockchain test generation is not supported yet. So I guess for blockchain test, I will have to use Aleph test it. This is the one I used all the time, and the state test could be generated.
Are the blockchain tests generated straight from the state tests, or does it need functioning inside of Aleph to work right now?
The difference between those group of tests that blockchain tests could contain many blocks and many transactions and some malicious blocks. And state test is a basic form of test with one transaction. So it could easily be converted into simple blockchain test with one block and one transaction. And these tests are run by Hive. So it's enough to create the simple one transaction test with changes that include like your EAP could include a change, and you could test it with one transaction. It should be enough. So majority of the test cases could be implemented by this one transaction change. So it's not that very critical that blockchain tests are not yet supported, but well, it's going to be implemented soon.
so are we agreeing on using retest tests to generate the testing for all the tentatively accepted and accepted EAPs, and trying to get not only Dimitri to do that, but to try and involve as many people as possible in generating those tests.
Sounds like a good idea. We're already doing this for EIP 1962.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea to me as well.
Great. So yeah, let's just make sure to communicate that clearly, that EAP champions / teams should be looking at retest that and trying to generate the reference tests for their EAPs. Does anyone else have anything else about testing they want to discuss?
One thing is that even if we assume that all the EAP champions generate the tests, I would love to see some like centralized green light from the testing team, from Dimitri, to say that the test coverage for the given EAPs is enough. Like still some overseeing process, and generally we should focus now on testing, since we have the list of accepted, tentatively accepted EAPs. The testing should be just our focus now, and we should clearly state, okay, we transition to testing stage now. The next requirement is the set of tests, and this is the way we're going to implement everything.
That seems pretty reasonable. Is there a way to ensure that there's not like a duplication of work, so that the testing team doesn't do, and the EAP champions don't like do the same work in parallel?
I have some ideas. Well, if you analyze the bytecode, you could potentially detect the patterns which are repeated in already implemented tests. And this is just an idea.
Maybe it makes most sense that the EAP champions like are responsible to produce these tests in order to deduplicate the work.
One thing that's been the fuzz testing team has been working on for a while is generating code coverage reports, in particular of Geth and parity. So this would show the code coverage of both the state test suite and the fuzz testing corpus, and where any gaps are, and so forth. So it would be nice if that could be published on a kind of dashboard. And I assume another priority will be to get Hive tests up and running again, because that seems to be down for maintenance right now. Or, I mean, it's up, but yeah, the tests clearly aren't working correctly on the Hive dashboard.
I'd love to hear Hive team on this call, maybe during the next call, because testing will be our focus now. So obviously Dmitry can give us some update now on what stage we are already, but maybe the Hive team directly. Dmitry, are you involved in Hive as well?
I'm involved in the part of providing the blockchain test from the state test that we have. And Hive is probably not working right now because there was some changes. The blockchain test organization split the folders, so you need to do some changes to the script of the Hive.
Yeah, sometimes the Hive team has a hard time keeping up with Dimitri.
Okay, so I guess just to summarize this, we're saying EAP champions should own generating the reference test for their EAPs, but we should also have the testing team kind of as a central point, looking at everything and greenlighting it. And we should try to get the Hive team on the next call to discuss this in more detail. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Cool. Anything else on testing? Okay. So the next agenda item was basically looking at the testnet upgrade and next steps for Istanbul. I feel we've kind of done this ad hoc across the rest of the call, but does anyone have anything they want to add on this? Okay. And I think it might just be worth noting that it would be good on the next call to pick a block for the testnet, just because it'll be the last, well, it'll be the second to last call before we actually want to fork. Yeah, and the next agenda item was reviewing the previous decisions and action items from the last calls. But I just want to leave this space if anyone has anything else they want to discuss. Okay. So the previous call, basically we had a lot of EAPs that got both accepted and tentatively accepted. I won't go over the entire list because we kind of rehashed it already. And we didn't have any outstanding action items. And then the call before that, because we didn't get to reviewing stuff on the previous call, we had, again, a lot of EAPs accepted in terms of the decisions, so no need to go back over these. The actions required were reviewing 1283, 1706. This seems to be happening, and we touched on it earlier around the 2200 discussion. Some note about the Nexal Core Dev calls, which we're having right now. 1344, which we've accepted, and then continue discussing 1962. So we've definitely done that. So next step on the agenda is just updates from either working groups, testing, clients, or research. So if anyone has anything they want to share, please do.
Well, I mean, we already covered it, but just for completeness, there's a document up at ETH Magicians in the existing thread. I don't know where we put the links for for these meetings, but there's a link for ETH Magicians with the proposal. That like James already said, that basically covers how we would actually write the code. I'm still I have sort of a first pass analysis of the economic impact. How people feel about this proposal. We may do another a more in-depth economic impact as well for EIP 1559.
Was there an intended time frame between phase 1 and phase 2? How long would class be given?
Yeah, I mean that I don't feel comfortable, sort of unanimously making that decision. So I think, we just need to open it up to the community and have that conversation. I'm open to just the next fork, whatever that plan is. I don't think we need to plan a fork just for that change. I think whatever forks go in, it would be good to just sort of get into a cadence and follow along with that cadence.
So something on the order of 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, that seems fine with me. I mean, maybe 3 months instead of 6, but I don't, I'm really open to suggestions there.
Cool. Thanks for the update, Rick. Anyone else have anything they want to share?
I just wanted to clarify. There was a question earlier in the call that, or somebody said that they didn't start working on some EIPs because they were only tentatively accepted and some decisions had to be made. So to clarify, the tentatively accepted EIPs are like they must be implemented because they are going in like, either in October or in January, definitely. Is that correct?
So my understanding, especially with the ones we've added today, is the clients should begin the implementation, but some of them still have like outstanding issues, whether this is like for the gas cost, the benchmarks, for ProgPal, there was the audit. So clients should start on the implementation, but I don't think we're ready to assume it'll get included in an upgrade for sure if the sort of outstanding issues with these EIPs don't get resolved. Does that make sense?
So maybe we should then call them somewhat differently because some of these EIPs are like we know that we need to include them and it's just a matter of getting the checklist done, and some others are still maybe not decided completely. So that doesn't make sense to differentiate between these two types.
I would.
I think for
go ahead.
tentatively accepted. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
The thing. I think for tentatively accepted EIPs, we know exactly there are some actions required. So for ProgPal, we need audit. For 1962, we're waiting for the review of the correctness of it, right? I've seen some discussions on all core devs. For some others, we wait only for benchmarks for the gas repricing. And I think that's it, really. There's 3 actions that are needed.
So my understanding is that the ones that are currently in tentatively accepted would still need to move to accepted, and that would start happening either after testnet activation or after mainnet, the October fork, the mainnet fork happens. Then that's when the discussion begins to move EIPs from the tentatively accepted list up to the accepted list. That's how I would expect it to go.
And the big question there is if it's part of the October or the January one, and then that will be kind of decided by those things. And I think it's also important to say, just for people who are listening to this from the outside, that saying that it's in now doesn't mean that there isn't going to be something that comes up through testing that we have to kick an EIP out due to something we don't understand yet. So it isn't like we're going to do everything. We are locked into all of these being it. It's these are the yeses, and everyone should move forward that these are the ones until we find out a reason for them not to be.
Yeah, I will +1 that, James. And one thing I'd maybe like to propose is having the next call, so the mid-August one, be the last call for something to go from the tentatively accepted to accepted list. So where it's basically the last chance for something to be included in the October fork, which anyways, just time-wise it kind of is, but maybe that's a way we can better sort of discriminate between the 2 forks, is moving whatever's tentatively accepted to accepted in the next call, using that accepted list for the October fork, and then continuing the discussion on the other tentatively accepted lists for the sort of Q1 2020 fork.
Yeah, I would second that as well.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think the strong message for the community, these are EIPs and these are the actions that we are expecting from both champions and community to deliver as for benchmarking, testing, and pointing out any vulnerabilities security-wise. And the clear message as well, what we rejected is not coming back. So people know that there is 10 or 11 EIPs, as we see on the list, that they clearly considered for Istanbul. And this is what we are focusing on now.
Great. Does anyone else have anything they want to bring up? Okay, then for the first time in what seems like months, we finished early. So happy to give everybody 4 minutes back.
Thanks everyone.
Buddy.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.